about 30 years ago. And I have done a lot of research about him because I have a penchant for these difficult and controversial souls. You have a look at his face. Isn't it a lovely flinty face? And wouldn't he disapprove of me? There have been lots of books written about him, and sometimes he's described as quite saintly, and sometimes he's described as this awful despot. And as usual, I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. And so some people go, well, he was a great free thinker. He didn't go with the church. And some others go, well, he was a fanatic. And some say, well, he was a patriarch and he created this wonderful community. And others go, no, he was a despot who ruled them with an iron rod. The stories for McLeod have been passed down through the generations. He was born 250 years ago, 245 years ago. And so there's been many generations, and it's not just in New Zealand. They've been passed down in Cape Breton, where he lived for 30 years. And there are also myths about him in Scotland, where he lived for the first 37 years of his life. And of course, as is with oral tradition, things get embellished, things get changed. There are different interpretations, so sometimes it's quite hard to tease the man out of his mythology. But we can try, and this is my take on McLeod. I was going to say to you, if you've got other opinions, let me know. But then I feel like bull rush. I'm not going to open the floor to you at the moment. You can come and quietly come and say, no, you've got it all wrong afterwards. So we're following in the footsteps of McLeod. I desperately wanted to do the whole thing, but going to Nova Scotia is eye-wateringly expensive. So we just went to Scotland instead, and we went there in about 2017. So I took hundreds of photos as we went around, and then, as is the way with digital photographs, I never printed any of them off. I didn't back them up properly, and most of them got lost. However, I've got enough for it to cobble together for this talk. Now, I haven't used a pointer before. He was born in Clacktoll, right in the northwest corner. He went to University Aberdeen. Then he went down to Edinburgh for further study. Then he got a job in Ullapool. Then he went up to Wick for fishing, and then he left from Ullapool. So that's just to centre us. You can see, even though Scotland's a small country, he crisscrossed it. He was always a restless, ambitious soul. He was born in Clacktoll, 29th of September 1780. That's 250 years ago. My memory of getting there, memory is faulty, of course, but the roads in Scotland are narrow. And you're driving along them, and they've got those little bays that you can pull into to let the cars go the other way. And we were driving along the top northern coast of Scotland, and then you turn off and to an even more narrow road with no little bays. And you go along there and you're going, there's nothing here. There's just hills, there's bracken, there's no trees, little boggy towns. And then suddenly you turned off that road, and what I remember has been quite a rutted track. And you suddenly land up, and it opened up, and there was a caravan park. And there's nothing more desolate than an empty caravan park, because it was October. So any holiday makers, apparently people do go there to camp. It was hard to believe that day. There were a couple of cottages. We could see his memorial, so we walked up to it, and it's lovely because you stand on the small cliffs and you can see it's rocks and wild ocean. And that day, the wind felt like it was straight off the Arctic. It just snatched tears from your eyes. It was bitterly cold. And you suddenly go, so this is what helped forge this man. He grew up in these bitter conditions, and the sound of the sea would have been his constant background for his life. So that was really good. I was very disappointed. I didn't expect a village. I'd hoped for a cottage, but there were none. So we ended up having to go to a recreation of a Highland village and what it would have looked like. So it's very likely he grew up in a house something like this. Stones, reeds, thatch, not much there because of course there's not much wood. His family were farmers and fishermen, and his dad was a proctor, which is a leader, but not much money attached to it or status. So this is the inside of the bothy, and you do have to smile here because this has got nicely plastered walls. It's nicely lit with electric light. So what you have to do is go, okay, so we're probably gaslight if they're lucky, probably reed torches or tallow candles that they make by themselves. The floor is probably beaten earth, would be smoky because the fire goes all the time. There'd be those pungent smells coming from the earth. And talking of pungent smells, often they used to bring animals into the other side in winter. That would keep the animals warm, but also the animals' warmth would help heat the bothy. So pretty tough conditions to grow up in. This was what particularly caught my fancy, because if you look at this very simple wheelbarrow, it's still got a wooden wheel. He was born something like 40 or 50 years before vulcanized rubber became used a lot. So you're going, it's a very different mindset from what we think of today. He was also born before universal education, but Scotland was very good at educating, and he did go to school, and he was apparently brilliant at his studies. He smashed all the exams and was first. And our first description of him is that he was a clever, irreverent, forward youth. Now, one of the stories, this is one of the stories, is that he met his wife Mary there, and she was in the same class, and she was equally bright and sometimes even beat him in exams. We'll keep. Now, Mary has very much left out of his story. She's the odd sentence here and there. And I've read lots of books about him, and I don't think I could put together 2 pages of her. But she was there beside him all the time. So I'm going to be threading Mary through the story. After he left school, he probably went fishing and farming with his family. He was not part of the clearances. Look at it. No Englishman wants that. They were busy clearing the East Cape, where it was much east side, which was much more clement. It was flatter. It was more accessible. Nobody wanted this rocky corner up here. But he was always ambitious. He knew that he was better than just being a fisherman. He wanted to be an educated man. And finally, I presume he saved his shekels. He got to Aberdeen University. This was in his late 20s, so he's quite determined to keep going. He graduated when he was 32, and he was obviously very clever because he got a gold medal for philosophy. And this is a row of cottages that are still there in Aberdeen from his time period, and it's lovely because you walk along these cobblestones and you go past these cottages and you go, McLeod would have known these roads, he would have known these cottages. But I've got this photo because I got Jeff to stand next to the door. Jeff is 6 foot. McLeod was well over 6 foot. I think he had Viking blood in him. He had these long, rangy limbs. He had these startling blue eyes. He had those cavernous cheekbones. And so he was, and then of course, having worked as a fisherman, he was a physically powerful man. So you can imagine him ducking his head to get into these small rooms. And he would have towered over a lot of the Celtic people who tend to be a bit small. And then, of course, with malnutrition in those days, they would have been even smaller. So he would have been this huge physical presence. Added to that, his absolute conviction that he is right. And it burns in him. So he must have been a formidable soul. I suspect when he came into these little rooms, everybody would just melt to the walls. The next story that I really like is that Mary was so captivated by him that one Christmas she decided to surprise him and walk across Scotland to Aberdeen to say Happy Christmas. as you can see, there's not much there again. You know, this is today. So you think about her walking with inadequate shoes. She would have had those shawls that you wrap around your head. It's a mighty trip. So I think we must always say, he was mighty, but so was Mary. And clearly McLeod thought so too, because they got married. And then by this stage, he knew for sure he wanted to be a minister, so they went to Edinburgh. Now, Edinburgh, of course, is still a high university then. Of course, it was the most prestigious university in Scotland. It was Oxford, Cambridge, English didn't count, Scottish. So it's this hotbed of intellectualism. You'd think that McLeod would settle in and just thrive here. But no, he knew better than the lecturers. He clashed with them all. He was appalled at what he saw, the moral degeneracy of the church at the time. And again, we must just put this into perspective of how early this is. This etching is from 1827. He's there in 1813, so Jane Austen is just publishing Pride and Prejudice. Battle of Waterloo is still a couple of years in the future. He couldn't stay there, so he just quit his studies in disgust. And he and Mary moved to Ullapool. Here he became a teacher at the SPCK school. It's Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge. To my best of my knowledge, that is the school, that white building. It's very hard you can't always, not every, in Scotland they just take their history for granted, so you're looking at an old building, but there's nothing to tell you is it 400 years old or 200 years old. And of course it makes a difference with McLeod. He was teaching there quite cheerfully, but there was a local minister, Dr. Thomas Ross, and they clashed immediately. The description of Thomas Ross, not from McLeod, is that he was a self-indulgent man who drank far too much. McLeod had a lot more to say than that about him. At this stage, McLeod had decided that he was going to be a lay minister, so he's out on the fields, on the hillsides, and people are coming from miles to hear him. And you can imagine him, because he's this tall, powerful presence, and he would be giving them his fervent, strongly convicted ideas. And this is one of his descriptions of the free-thinking ministers. They're not only mere doodles and ding-dongs, weathercocks and worldlings, fanatics and formalists, flatterers and fugitives, but also suckers and swindlers, tipplers and tavern hunters, pokers and persecutors, bankrupts and bigamists. And you can see, you go, oh, go Norman. And I had to put it up for you because look at his wonderful alliterations, those F's, the S's, the T's, and that wonderful galloping rhythm that underlines it. And I actually think Shakespeare would have been quite envious of some of his rhetoric. So you can see that it would have been riveting stuff, and they would have come from miles to hear him. He loathed Ross so much that when he and Mary had their first baby, he refused to have Ross baptize the baby. So they walked 40 miles to the next town. And wouldn't you know it, as luck would have it, Dr. Ross happened to be there. And so he had a quick word with the minister, who then refused to baptize the baby. And so Norman and Mary had to walk all the way back with their baby unbaptized. And again, just putting a plug in for Mary. She's given birth, she's got a baby, she's probably breastfeeding, and she walks all these miles. We don't know. Did she agree with Norman and absolutely supported him in it? Was she merely humouring him? I'm so sad that history doesn't record her. Ross had decided he had had enough of this uppity preacher, so he wrote to the school to get him fired. He described him as a restless, ambitious and dangerous character, active in exciting disturbance and dissension wherever he goes. And I have to say, having read quite a lot about McLeod, you go, yeah, that's a pretty fair description actually. So he lost his job. He went back to fishing and moved up to Wick. So now we're on the top northeast corner of Scotland. Again, it's bitter, hard work. The herring Fishing was a really big thing in those days. It was the major industry. I'm very sorry I lost the photos from here because they're photos of women with their head scarves and their big skirts, and their hands must have been raw because their job was to pack the fish into these salted barrels. Here they had another child, but McLeod was burning with unrealized ambition, and as so many young Scots, vigorous Scots with lots of initiative and courage and no prospects of succeeding in Scotland, he decided that he has to immigrate. So they moved back to Ullapool. And I'm so pleased that this photo survived. This is right on the water's edge, and this is, it's now a pub, and it's a building from McLeod's time. So I sat in this window and I thought, this is where Mary would have sat, because she didn't go with him. He was going to sail forward and see what was out there first. So she's left with 2 children, and she's pregnant with the 3rd, and she's watching him sail away. And so that was in July 1817. Who knows what he was going to... they're all very courageous. So those descendants of these Nova Scotians, they were remarkable, I think. It was a long and dangerous journey. As you can see, it was, let's see, there we go. Nearest landfall, if you're sailing west, is Cape Breton in Canada. But you've got the Atlantic Ocean between you, and it was a harsh time. I mean, this is where poor old Titanic met its match. They halfway across, and sure enough, they hit terrible storms. They started taking on water, and the captain said, "We have to go back to Scotland. We're not going to make it." Good old McLeod, he has never trusted anyone in his life except himself. And of course, he's a man of the sea, so he's been charting themselves. And he goes, no, we're closer to Nova Scotia than we are to Scotland. We must keep going. So they had this terrific row on the captain shouting, "I'm going to put you in chains and throw you down below." But McLeod stood firm and convinced them, and so they sailed forth, and sure enough, they arrived in Nova Scotia safe and sound. And this went part towards his mythology, because then people go, God seems to be on this man's side, and he knows what he's doing, and he's a strong leader, you can trust him. So he arrived in Waipū and sent for Mary and the children. So now Mary's about to do the same dangerous journey. No history book mentions this virtually, but she's doing it now with 2 children, little ones, and a baby at the breast. So go Mary, I say. I often feel like her, when people used to rhapsodize about Fred Astaire dancing, and Ginger Rogers would say, "Oh, I do everything he does, but I do it backwards and in heels." I always feel like that about Mary. I go, but she also was having the children. So, she arrived, but Pictou was quite a melting pot of a place. You've got the Canadians, you've got the native Canadians, you've got English coming in, but Scottish pouring in, you've got the French in there, you've got whalers and sailors coming in and out. And of course, when you've got a mixing pot like that, you tend to have quite a riotous wee town. McLeod was not impressed. So he goes, describing the town. "Oh, the hateful pride and rank obstinacy, the deep-rooted worldliness and dreadful malignity, the secret contempt of God and good men, with all their direful train of concomitants that are hiddenly lurking and domineering in the breast of every carnal and unregenerated man in the world." I'm just sorry I can't do it in a Scots accent, but I also want to just remind you that he grew up speaking Gaelic, and English is his second language, and hasn't he got a remarkable command of it? But having said that about the town of Hisi, he couldn't stay. They were offered land in Ohio, so he and some of the other men from the community, because by this stage a lot of the Scots had come over, some to join him, some because they're looking for a place to be. They set sail, and a big storm came up. This is one of the stories. I really like this one. And they got blown into a bay, into St. Anne's. And doesn't it look familiar? Couldn't it be Scotland? And when the storm cleared, they looked around. The land was empty, and they could see that they had good harbours. They had clear land to be able to plant their crops, because all McLeod's vision, and that presumably shared by all the others, was they just wanted to be a self-sufficient community where they could have their Gaelic ways and their language and not be bothered by the rest of the world. They settled in very well here. They did set up farms, they set up boat building, they went trading as far as the West Indies. Quite a lot of the men now are trilingual because they've added French to their languages. But sadly, there's nothing left there. My lovely friend Bonnie in the back row went there a few years ago for me, and there's nothing left. So sad. And it's something that you do become aware of when you're following somebody's footsteps, is how much of history is lost. We tend to preserve the palaces and the castles. We tend to reserve, the fine homes. But the lives of the modest and the lives of the poor are often just erased, and you don't see them at all. So you have to fill it in. So fill it in. There's a lovely, thriving community here. Being good Scots, they've built their church, they've built their school, and McLeod becomes teacher there. He teaches maths, Latin and Greek. Now this is gold for these kids. Their parents, a lot of them are illiterate, and with this education they went forward and they became, they always mow the lawns when we can't talk. They went and became lawyers, they became doctors, they became very canny businessmen, they became politicians. He really set up that next generation fantastically. In 1823, he became magistrate, and some people said, it's a lot of power to have, for one man to have. But of course, the Scots were used to having the laird system, where one man was in charge of the whole community. And then in 1827, at the age of 47, he's finally ordained. What determination, what drive that he would keep that focus all that time. You'll be pleased to know his invective was as powerful as ever. Once he was railing against women, saying extravagance in dress is and has been now for a long time one of the crying sins of our time. Her Majesty Victoria is not half so proud of her royal robes, her diamond endowments, as our mushroom maids are of their belts and beads, busks and bonnets, combs and crimping pins, rings and ringlets, lace and lockram, locks and linings. And even poor Mary wasn't safe. Once she sold a chest of drawers and bought herself a very nice bonnet, and she was sitting in the congregation, and he goes, and there she sits with a chest of drawers upon her head. And I hope very much that when she got back, she said, Mr. McLeod, you must get over yourself a bit. But he was strict. Some say that he didn't allow music and singings. Others say he didn't allow singing and dancing, but it still continued. Some say that he used to have the taps turned off the maple trees on the Sabbath, and that children weren't allowed to pick the fruit. They had to eat it off the tree. I'm a little bit skeptical, because it sounds to me like it would be more like bobbing for apples. I don't know, I've never tried it. So afterwards, if you've actually eaten fruit off a tree with your hands behind your back, please let me know. There was another side to him, though, apart from this domineering side. People who knew him well said he was very warm, he was kind, he was gentle, he was compassionate. He certainly, The community was a lovely, safe one, it sounds like. Everything was shared, so there would be a lot of working frolics where the women would get together for the sewing and the weaving. The men would do the building together. Never any locks on the doors. Here Mary had 10 children altogether. 2 died before adulthood. Sadly, Mary was getting sick at this stage. She was, there's references to her being unwell and sometimes being bedridden. Best guess, I think, is rheumatoid arthritis. I talked to a Scottish nurse and she said very likely, because having grown up in those homes with all that dampness in the winter and the earth floors, it just would have gone into her bones. And this is also where I do my math. So she and McLeod married when they were 32. If she's the same age as him and was in school with him, then she's 37 when he sails away, and she's only got 3 children and has got to fit in another 7. So you go, interesting and not impossible, but you do think maybe the stories are not always completely accurate. His letters, I do love going back to the original sources as much as possible. So I've read some of McLeod's letters, and they start off really warmly. He always says, "Dear so-and-so," and then asks after their health. And it isn't just a cursory, "How are you?" and then moves on. But he really sounds like he cares, and he asks a lot about them and their family members. He often mentions Mary, and they had another sickly child too, a son. And he talks about them. And just when you're thinking, oh, you are a real sweetie, he'll hit a hobby horse, and then he's off. And there's pages and pages and pages of rhetoric. And you go, oh, Norman, I just couldn't be bothered reading them. So I landed up feeling about him that, he's probably like some, in the community, there's people that you can really love, admire. You can think they're fine, fine people. You just kind of hope you don't sit next to them at a dinner party. But his popularity was growing all that time. So I don't think he could have been a despot, because my experience with Scottish people and the descendants of Nova Scotians is they're not easily pushed around at all. They choose what they want. So they'll end up having to build a new church that could seat 1,200 because so many were coming from other communities. One minister simply gave up shop, closed the church, and said to the remainders of his church, "Oh, go on, you go and join him." So things were going along nicely for 30 years, although the winters were bitter there. And then disaster struck. The wheat crop failed and potato blight set in, and they had terrible winters, and people started starving. And the vulnerable died, and even the hale and hearty got withered down into skin and bone. And McLeod talks about the agony of it, watching the people get so sick. So what is left at St. Anne's are still some gravestones. It's interesting what gets left behind, isn't it? We don't know whether this is a relative of McLeod or not, but apparently there's also an urquhart in that graveyard. At the same time as people are starving, Norman is receiving letters from his son Donald, who's down in Australia, who's writing going, "Don't stay there, come down here. The climate's fantastic, there's land aplenty, we've got lots of opportunities. Everyone should come down here." And other people in the community were also getting similar letters from their family. And it ended up splitting the community. Some were saying, "We've got to go." Some were saying, "Don't be silly, we've already moved across the world once, we're going to stay." And so there were big discussions about it. And then, and McLeod knew that he was old. He's 67 now, and he says, "I've only got this window of mortality left to me." But then he's thinking about his children and the young people of the community, and he says, "I don't know what more important duty I could fulfill for them in the business of life than to assist and accompany them from this now dreary and desperate place to a kind of paradise." And I think the words are really important here, because he's talking about assist and accompany. He's not laying down the law. He's not saying they must. He's there to support only. He didn't want to go, but it was decided that they would send off a boat to see what the situation was like. So they built the Margaret. Now, any of you who have had teenage daughters, you can spare a thought for poor old McLeod. Margaret was his daughter. It sounds like she might have been his favourite daughter. And she fell very much in love with a man that he deemed totally unacceptable. The story I like is that they eloped to the next town where they got married and then waited a few days for his temper to settle down. And I suspect Mary might have been saying then, you know, you've got two choices. You can accept it or you have to throw it out of the family. And bless him, he accepted it. The other one isn't quite as exciting, and he didn't like the match, but he had agreed, and they actually got married, I think in Australia or New Zealand. So they set sail there, but before they go, he has one last sermon, and he is standing on the hillside on a rock by the harbour. They couldn't go into the church because there were so many people had come from all around to say goodbye. Apparently it was a terribly emotional time because the community was breaking up. Some families were being separated, friends were being separated, and a lot were heartbroken that they wouldn't see Norman McLeod again. And in fact, one woman said that she was going to nail up her front door because no minister would ever come through that front door because that was his door. So they sailed away, 140 of them on this boat. He's 71 now, and Mary's right there beside him. So she's gone, and again we go Mary, because she's very frail, she's probably in a lot of pain, and she does this massive voyage across the world. So you can see they sailed from Canada down past Africa and all the way to Australia. They arrived in Melbourne just in time for the gold rush. Wouldn't you know his luck? And so, of course, with gold rush comes gambling and prostitution and drinking, and poor old McLeod's wondering, what is this Gomorrah I have landed in? And he's gently appalled by it all, but actually worse happens because typhoid rips through the fields, and in a couple of months, he and Mary lose 3 of their sons. So now they're out of 10 children, they've got 5 left. And so not surprisingly, they see the land as cursed. And they have to have discussions about what to do next. So they've got 3 options. They could go back to Nova Scotia. They can try and make a living in Melbourne. Or they could go on to this other country, New Zealand, because one of them has been trying to negotiate land. His name was Duncan the Prince Mackenzie. And again, often it's said that McLeod was doing the negotiations. We know he wrote to Governor General once, Governor Grey, at least once, because there's record of the letter. But most of the negotiations were done by the prince. And again, what they wanted was land that had nobody around it, that they could have a Gaelic community and be self-sufficient. The story is that McLeod actually wrote and said, we want a land that doesn't have Maori on it, because having seen the trauma of the clearances in Scotland, he didn't want to displace any people. If any of you have got a record of this, I would love to hear it, because I've looked and looked and I can't find any record of it. So they sailed away again, and on the 21st of September 1853 they arrived in Auckland. Then they sailed up to Waipū and the Whangārei Heads. Does it look familiar? Couldn't it be Scotland? Couldn't it be Cape Breton? They must have felt God's hand was in this. And in fact, the first time I ever drove out to the Heads, I was halfway along the road and I was going, gosh, this reminds me of Scotland. So, you know, that there's those echoes in the landscape. They thought this was perfect. It looks like Scotland and Nova Scotia, except that the climate is so much better. And so they send all these letters off to Nova Scotia saying, we found paradise. And there's this extraordinary migration of 800 people over the next few years who come down to join them. Lots of uniting of family and friends, a lot of joyous times. But very sadly, Mary died soon after their arrival. But I like to think that she was hopeful that they had finally found the right place for them. Being Scots, they built their churches and their schools in Waipū and the Heads, and the Heads still has theirs. So the Whangārei Heads school was built in 1858, and it's the second oldest school still operating on the original site. And the Heads church is, some say, it's often dated to 1858, that same year. Some say it was built in the 1860s, but either way, it's said to be the third oldest Presbyterian church in New Zealand. McLeod definitely preached in this. There was a lot of coming and going between the Heads and Waipū. Of course, these people have been sailors all their lives, so it's just a quick jump across the water. And in fact, at low tide, they said that they would swim their horses across from Marsden Point to Reatahi. There's one story of the boat coming back from the Heads, and they're coming back into Waipū, and the boat gets overturned and a couple of people drown. But there's one Dolina, and I love the story because she had her crinoline on and the air caught up under her skirts. And so she rode the waves to the shore, which I think is very elegant. And there's a Dolina in the graveyard at the Pioneer Cemetery in McLeod Bay, and I like to think that that's her. The church is still used. This is my daughter's wedding, and it is my favouriteest church in the world. It's made out of kauri, so it just glows gold. And as you can see, it's got all that simplicity of the Nova Scotian, of the Scottish, very unadorned, and it's just got, I think, an amazing atmosphere. I also really love it because now it's used by several different denominations, and I hope McLeod would appreciate that. But of course, we're talking about people here. They were not all saints. Some say that when they came here originally, the farmers went to Waipū because it's nice and flat, and the fishermen and boat builders went to the Heads because they had the anchorages and the wood to build boats. It's also said that those who didn't like McLeod scampered over to the Heads where they could sing and play their music. I don't know. Again, if anyone knows, let me know. But this you will recognise as Smuggler's Cove, and it was well named. These guys had been smuggling, some of them had been smuggling all their lives, starting in Scotland and in Canada. They used to do alcohol, rum, and various things. And so at Smuggler's Cove, a lot of you will remember that on the right-hand side of this photograph at the bottom, there's the big cave that would make a perfect place to stash stuff. And then there's the lovely story of the barrels having been delivered onto Lang's Beach, but the revenue men are sailing up the coast, so there's a scamper while they dig the holes into the beach, quickly bury the barrels, and then they run the cattle over it so that the disturbance of the sand won't be remarkable. So the smuggling you go, that's quite fun. The other side of it was a few of them got involved in blackbirding, and I'd never heard this term, and I said, what is blackbirding? And a lot of you will know that they used to sail up to the Pacific Islands and take the young men from there and take them either to Fiji or to Northern Australia. So, unfortunately, history doesn't always want to fit your nice, tidy patterns of people. Life, for generally, I've blown my point. There we go. So the community settled in nicely. Farms have been built. You are the descendants, some of you, from them. But at this stage, McLeod is getting quite old and frail. And in the summer of 1866, he became bedridden. So many people wanted to see him that he had his bed taken, pushed across to under the window so that they could come past and talk to him. So to me, it's not a despot. People would have quietly been too busy in the fields, I'd suspect. And he died on the 14th of March. He was 85 years old. And I think he has the best final words of anybody on a deathbed. He says, "Children, children, look to yourselves, the world is mad." And I think it absolutely epitomizes the philosophy he lived by. But I look around the world today and I go, you know, McLeod, I think you were right. So very good advice 245 years later. He's buried in Waipū, and right in the center of the cemetery, which feels right. Mary's next to him, and of course her grave is not as fine as his, but his is by no means the most ostentatious in the graveyard, and I think that's very fitting for him. And of course he's left this massive legacy for us all. So in Whangarei, we've got Waipū does such a good job with their wonderful museum, which is a real taonga of the region. And we've got the wonderful Highland Games at New Year, and the tartan fashion show, and all the bagpipes and the singing and the dancing. It's great. But the Celts are also remembered in Nova Scotia. Although St Anne's itself has disappeared, there is this Celtic school there that's there for the language and the arts and crafts, and they've kept up links with Whangarei all over all these generations, which is quite remarkable. I remember a play coming out from there and being in Forum North here about Norman McLeod's life. And of course he's remembered in Scotland, where he started, and this memorial was put up, I think it was in the 1980s, and I think what a fitting monument it is for him, because it's so hard and so unflinching, and it looks like it's going to endure forever, doesn't it? And I hope his legacy will too. I was surprisingly touched to see it, and thinking about McLeod, I think he was fascinating. He certainly was domineering and fearless, and he had this knack of sending men into foments of fury and frustration. Yet he was also compassionate, and he gave so much of his self to his flock. All he ever wanted was the best for his people, whether they liked it or not, maybe, and whether it was entirely right, but of course he knew he was right. So I certainly think he deserves to be remembered, and I hope with all those people who've got a lot vested in him, you won't be too offended by my take of him. So thank you.